My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas.
My guest is Pietra Rivoli. She specializes in international business, finance, and social issues in business at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. Her book, The Travels of a T-Shirt in the Global Economy, takes a look at globalization through the prism of a single humble consumer item, the T-shirt. Pietra, welcome to the Marketplace of Ideas.
Thanks very much, Colin.
First question is going to be a fairly broad one, or maybe not, but how did you settle on a T-shirt as the consumer item through which to view globalization? Why the T-shirt?
Well, there were a number of reasons that I chose a T-shirt. You know, first of all, it's something that everyone can identify with, and everyone owns probably way too many in the United States. And I think that, you know, this is something that each of us pull over our head every day without even thinking about it, but it's a product that has such a global life story, yet it's such a simple thing. And so something that combined those ideas, a global product, but something that's simple that everybody can relate to, was one appeal of the T-shirt. The other main reason for choosing a T-shirt is that when I first started thinking about these topics, globalization was just coming into discourse in the United States, and it was the subject of a lot of activism, a lot of protests, and, you know, we're still seeing echoes of that today. But on college campuses, one of the aspects of globalization that was attracting a lot of attention was the alleged sweatshop conditions under which university apparel was produced. And so many college students, and this was taking place, you know, around the country, were looking at the T-shirts that said, you know, UC Santa Barbara or Georgetown or what have you across the front, and they were asking, you know, where did this come from? Was it produced in something that we would think of as a sweatshop? Were the workers treated fairly? Are the workers paid on time? Are the workers, you know, free to unionize? You know, they had all of these questions about the process by which these T-shirts came into existence. And, you know, their questions were motivated by, you know, concerns about the effects of market competition and a rapidly globalizing economy. And so, you know, to address kind of directly some of the issues that the students were thinking about, that's the second reason I chose the T-shirt.
As many writers on globalization say that globalization is not itself a new thing, but when did the word globalization come into the discourse?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess you started to see it used a lot in the press in the 90s. You know, that's when you started to see a lot of books come out with globalization in the title. But, you know, you're certainly right. You can go back to the Silk Road days, or you can go back to the Roman Empire or even ancient Greece. And, you know, you see essentially international trade flows. So there's nothing new about economic linkages across countries. You know, what's new today, of course, is the pace of change and the speed at which these, you know, the borders are falling.
And I was chatting with a professor here at UC Santa Barbara just yesterday about your book, and he was describing globalization as being a new thing if you think of it in terms of single products moving from country to country, a supply chain that extends around the world. Is that a definition you would use for it as well?
Well, you know, globalization, there's so many definitions. You know, we can be talking about cultural or social or economic. Globalization really, I think, in broad terms, just has to do with kind of the disintegration of borders. And the borders can allow ideas to flow. They can allow money to flow. They can allow goods to flow. And so, you know, it's not a word that I would want to pigeonhole into a single definition. But certainly, the professor you spoke to is correct about one thing, and that's that if you look at the supply chain or the life story of a good such as a T-shirt, a generation ago, this story would have been largely a domestic story. So the cotton would have come from Texas, but the yarn would have been spun in North Carolina, and the T-shirt would have been stitched together in Alabama. That would have been typical at the time, say 30 years ago. it's no longer typical. Now the typical life story of something like a T-shirt is very much a global story.
And I should emphasize that you say just 30 years ago that was all happening in America. It wasn't that long ago,
It
really.
was not that long ago. That's right. It was not that long ago.
I want to get into the journey that your T-shirt took and that you took. How did you decide to start off where you did?
Yeah, that's a good question. Really, the way I look at this book is it's a biography. It's a life story. And so I had to follow the life story of this particular T-shirt, as closely as I could. Now, it was a random event, that led to me pulling this particular T-shirt out of a bin in a store in Florida. So I didn't go looking for a certain kind of T-shirt. I said, okay, let me just pick a T-shirt. And that selection, was a random thing. And then once I picked the T-shirt, now I guess I've developed some pretty good investigative skills. But, I used those skills to just, to trace back its life story, starting with the tag in the back of the shirt and, finding the person who had sold the shirt to the store and then finding the company that had imported it and then finding the textile mill and so forth and so on. So, really the story that I told is, is dictated by the life story of this particular T-shirt.
And the shirt itself would have started off as just grown cotton, and that took you to Texas. And what did you find there?
West Texas is actually, one of the world's most important cotton-growing regions, and that's been true for a number of years now. Cotton is a huge export for the United States. I think it's about our 8th largest export. And out of that, the most significant contribution is the West Texas region. The more I travel back to West Texas, I guess I was first there in about 1999, 2000 or so. My last trip was just a few weeks ago. It's a part of the world I never would have gotten to otherwise. One of the probably only reasons that, people travel to that part of Texas is if they have something to do with cotton or the cotton industry. And so it's not a place that I would have gone to otherwise. But I tell you, it's just grown on me. And every time I go back, I like it more and more. It started out feeling, I'm a city girl, and so it started out feeling to me very much like a foreign country. But I have developed such profound respect for the communities and the people and the industry and the business acumen that I found in West Texas, that it's becoming, one of my favorite places.
Not a place you just visit for business.
That's right. The last time I was there, I guess it was just right before Christmas. I went to one of the best parties I've been to in years in West Texas.
Right there in cotton-growing country, huh?
That's right. So I have a real affinity.
Why is the U.S. so good at exporting cotton?
Well, there are two questions in there. One is, why are we good at producing it? And then the second is, because we have to produce it in order to export. And the second is, why are we exporting so much? And so there's really two different answers. The reason that we are exporting so much is because, our domestic demand is really diminishing. So the traditional story has been, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, that the Texas cotton would go to the North Carolina textile mills. The textile industry in the United States has been for a number of years shrinking. It's in a lot of trouble because of foreign competition. And so there's no longer the demand in North Carolina for the cotton that's grown in Texas. Instead, the demand is overseas, especially in Asia, but also in Central America, where the textile and apparel industries are growing. So just because we can produce more and more cotton in the United States, of course, doesn't mean that it's going to be used here. So now, really, the market for this crop is overseas. Now, why are we so good at producing cotton? Well, this is something that I spend a great deal of time on in the book, because it was a question that I was very interested in myself. And there's not a simple answer to the question. Instead, I think there are a number of what I think of as virtuous circles going on that support this industry in the United States. If you look at the science behind the growing of cotton, the actual plant biology and so forth, some of the very best cotton research in the world takes place here in the United States. In fact, takes place at the universities in Texas. So if you think of kind of Silicon Valley as being the center of the intellectual creation of the high-tech community, well, West Texas is the intellectual center of the science of cotton. And, that is a tremendously, powerful boon for this industry. We also have, in place in the United States, many, many public policies that are designed to support growers of a few big cash crops. These include wheat, cotton, corn, and so forth. And, a lot of these policies are controversial, but the fact of the matter is, there they are. And the public policies that are put in place by the USDA, by the U.S. Congress, go a long way towards sheltering this industry from certain kinds of risks and helping them to maintain their, comparative advantage in the global economy.
I'd like to pose a counterfactual here. What would it be like? What would the industry be like if there were no agricultural subsidies? Who would be doing this cotton growing? Where would it be happening, do you think?
It's a complicated question. If you just took away the cash subsidies, I'm not sure we'd see dramatic changes. And there's actually been some research by a number of economists. What you would see is less cotton being grown in the United States. That would decrease world supply and probably drive up the market price of cotton. That is, of course, going to benefit farmers in a number of poor countries who would then be able to get a higher price for their cotton. It would not, I don't think, however, eliminate U.S. cotton growers. It would be a change that would, at the margin, drive some of them out of business, especially the ones that, are heavily leveraged. I think the more important, issue is really the web of protections and public policies that we have in place for U.S. farmers. These aren't necessarily subsidies per se. These are things like federally sponsored research. These are things like various kinds of crop insurance, and then even going to, our basic educational system. So there are advantages that are kind of conferred by public policies that aren't narrowly defined, really, subsidies, but are very important for the competitiveness of these growers.
After the cotton is grown, then where does it head off to?
Well, in the particular case of my T-shirt, once the cotton is grown, it's then ginned locally, and the ginned cotton is baled and shipped to Shanghai, to China. Now, China is by far the largest buyer of American cotton, far and away the biggest, but our cotton does go other places as well. It goes to Vietnam. It goes anywhere that there's a textile industry, really, because we're such a big exporter. But the lion's share of the exports are now going to China.
And when you went to China, tell me your impressions of Shanghai, of the production they've got going on there.
China is, very much on people's minds. There's not, of course, one China. There are many Chinas. When you first arrive in Shanghai, I've heard it described as it's sort of like being on the Jetsons. It's so futuristic. It's moving so fast. It's so modern. They've got a train that goes 260 miles an hour to take you from the airport, for example. You really do feel like you're stepping into another century, just with the pace of change. And so there's a glitz element to Shanghai that really is very beguiling. But of course, that's not all of China, and it's certainly not the world of the people who work in the garment factories. Once you get off the beaten track and you get into the factories, there's a much different country, that reveals itself. And, if you look at how China is making its way in the world, really they're becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. And, the origins of this were really in very low-tech industries. Their traditional dominance has been in toys and shoes and in clothing. And, none of these factories, in contrast, look like the glitzy Shanghai that you see when you step off the plane. China's economy is, of course, developing. They're branching into electronics and autos and so forth. But the manufacturing powerhouse especially in the southeastern part of China, really does still have its roots in these very basic, low-tech, labor-intensive kinds of factories.
Politicians will talk a whole lot in the U.S. about China essentially stealing American manufacturing jobs. And what's your take on that situation? What did you find out about what the situation that is perceived as that?
Oh, nobody's stealing American apparel workers' jobs. A number of things are happening to them. The difficulty with apparel is that it's a production process that's very, very difficult to mechanize. So there are many things that we now do with machines that we used to do with people. For example, picking cotton is one of them. However, in order to make a T-shirt, you need a human being sitting down at a sewing machine. And, and maybe someday that will no longer be true. Maybe someday we'll figure out how to get robots to do that. But for now, you need that human being, and you need them sitting at a sewing machine, sliding the fabric, and so forth. Now, in the United States, it's going to cost a good $12 an hour to find that person to sit at that sewing machine. And, of course, all over Asia, it's going to cost much less than $1 an hour. Now, I'm not sure how you can characterize that as, anybody stealing anything. It's just, it's an economic reality. At the same time, as I write in the book, China is actually starting to lose employment in this industry, too. And the reason for that is that so many steps of the process, especially spinning and knitting, actually are being mechanized. So if you look at, where the jobs are going, it's partly true that they're moving, but it's also partly true that they're just disappearing.
Yes, it was a good line in the book, as you said. The jobs aren't necessarily going to China; they're just going.
They're just going. That's absolutely right. They're just going, and this is something that we have to face in the United States, and we've had to face for a number of years now. The idea that you can drop out of high school and get a good job in the factory down the street with very few skills and be okay for life, is something that may have been true a generation ago, but it's certainly not true today. Now, whether it's productive or even realistic to blame some other country for that's another question. Now, there's no doubt that many people feel justifiably that in a lot of Chinese business practices, there's cheating going on. There are big problems with intellectual property theft in China. And, there are all kinds of other problems that are kind of characteristic of developing economies in general, but are probably more pronounced in China. So, there's no doubt that, there are some valid complaints. There's some valid complaints about the way the Chinese government subsidizes certain industries and so forth. But I think at the root of the issue, is the basic wage disparity. It's difficult for me to think of that as theft.
It's so different in terms of the price of labor from one country to another then.
It's not as if the T-shirts weren't coming from China. They'd, come back and open a factory in Alabama. That's not what would happen. If we somehow closed the gates on China, that production would move to Vietnam, or it'd move to India, or it would move to Central America.
Would it be accurate to say that the United States has had its turn as far as hosting a lot of manufacturing work, and that other countries are taking their turn now, and that their turn will be over as well?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And it's already happening, actually. It's already happening in many regions of China. This is the kind of industry that is incredibly mobile for a variety of economic and business reasons. And it is already true that in the area around Shanghai, the textile mills are closing, the garment factories are closing. The production is moving in search of lower costs.
Do you think there will come a day when the world as a whole is so wealthy that there won't be any hand labor at all done in these apparel factories? It's just going to be essentially one big machine?
Well, they have now textile mills that they call dark. And the reason they call them dark is because, you can actually turn off the lights because there aren't any people in there. It's all machines. It's a marvel, really. And I'm not an engineer, so I wouldn't be able to really predict where the engineering is going. But there's no doubt that, the historical trend is for labor to get more and more productive because the machinery that it has at its disposal is just getting more and more sophisticated.
I want to talk a little bit about a phrase that has been thrown around quite a lot by a crowd that would call themselves anti-globalization or cautious about globalization, and that is the phrase race to the bottom. And you talk a lot about that in your book. You kind of repurpose the phrase a little bit. What's your take on the race to the bottom?
I guess that the way we commonly understand that phrase is just the idea that we have this very competitive global market economy. It's powered by consumers, for example, in the United States. Consumers, according to this story, want cheaper and cheaper T-shirts. And so in the quest to put cheaper and cheaper T-shirts on the stores' shelves, the Walmarts of the world and so forth will go out searching the globe for the cheapest possible material, the cheapest labor, so forth and so on. And so there's kind of this engine that's driving the price of the T-shirts down and causing production to continue to move to the cheaper and cheaper location. And so that's kind of the idea of the race to the bottom. The question, of course, is, I think that, there's a lot of empirical reality to support the notion that production does tend to certain kinds of production anyway, tends to try to flow to where costs are lowest. The next question, of course, is, what are the effects of this, and is this a good or a bad thing? My summary judgment that I reach in the book is that the race to the bottom is a fact of the global economy. It's something that we are clearly observing every day. However, the bottom itself is not fixed. The bottom is rising. And this is evident in so many ways. If you look at conditions in a textile mill, 100 years ago in North Carolina, it's going to look much, much worse than a textile mill today outside of Shanghai. If you look at conditions in a garment factory in southern China today in 2008, it's actually going to look better than it did when I first went in 1999. And so, the idea that things are kind of spiraling downward into some increasingly awful place is what I take issue with. I think that, there's no doubt there are competitive pressures, but there are pressures pushing back the other direction. And overall, life, a day's work in a factory is better today than it was 10 years ago, and it's better 10 years ago than it was 100 years ago. So I think overall we're looking at a story of human progress.
So there may be a race to the bottom, but the bottom is getting better.
The bottom is rising.
I see. Now, what do you make of the modern day, I guess I should say current day, U.S. attempts at anti-China protectionism?
There are so many different kinds of that going on right now. I think that there are certainly pieces of it that are justified, and I think that there are certainly pieces of it that really are just, straight self-interested protectionism. We had a guest in my class yesterday speaking about Jesse Helms, the senator, who used to talk a lot about, what China was doing wrong. But, really his main interests were in protecting, the textile and the tobacco industries in his state. So I think that, it's not an easy issue. As I said a moment ago, there are a lot of things that I think we rightfully need to take China to task on. There are many ways in which China continues to not play by the rules with things such as intellectual property. At the same time, it's very difficult, for the United States to kind of maintain its moral authority and try to get the rest of the world to open up to trade while it also is putting in place various kinds of protection maneuvers. So, I think congressmen are basically pretty predictable. They're trying to protect their constituencies. And so when you have members of Congress who have textile mills and apparel factories and steel mills and whatnot in their districts. It's a kind of predictable outcome that they will try to protect those constituencies. And some of that, comes out as anti-China rhetoric.
It's just the very nature of the way politics is done here in the U.S. then.
And maybe even the way it should be done. Maybe these people were elected to represent certain constituencies.
Now, you mentioned intellectual property a few moments ago, and it's not a subject you cover in your book, but I was wondering, what are your thoughts on IP in a globalized world? How does that affect the intellectual property situation, do you think?
Well, that's something, of course, we've been trying to make progress on for a number of years in the WTO trade negotiations. It's a very, very tricky business, protecting intellectual property. There are some estimates, I think this is a World Bank estimate, that over 90% of the software in China and in Vietnam is pirated, is fake software.
Wow.
I actually had a personal experience with this. Somebody sent me a link to a website, and I found that there was a complete PDF of my book on a Chinese website, page for page, photos, everything, just a complete book, free for anybody who wanted to download and print it. So that's an example of, really intellectual property theft. So I didn't get my 25 cents in royalties, maybe. My publisher wasn't able to get the revenues, from publishing the book and so forth. And so, that is, just a small example of what you see every day in China. And it's a problem.
But back to the T-shirt, where does it go after China?
Well, after China, it was produced outside of Shanghai, and then it got on a ship and it came back to the United States, which is where I purchased it. And I do still have this T-shirt, and I hope to bring it to Santa Barbara, and maybe I can show it to you. But I did ask a question, and as I was thinking about this, I started to think about, well, what would I do? What happens to all our T-shirts kind of when we're done with them? And I started to investigate this question, and it was through that investigation that I came to be aware of another huge global industry, which is the used clothing industry, where most of the clothing that we get rid of, enters the global economy once again and goes to yet another continent.
And that was one of the most interesting, I thought, parts of the book, was describing the nature of this whole huge secondary clothing market. And you describe it primarily in Africa, but it's something that I'd never thought about. But how does it work?
Well, that's interesting because you're right. People don't think about it. They don't think about it at all. And why would we? It's not like the textile mills that are closing that are on the front page of the paper. Well, how does it work? It's the main way that it starts out working is you or I clean out our closets. Usually, we do this at the end of the year because we can get a tax deduction, and we end up taking all the clothing that we're tired of to usually someplace like the Goodwill or the Salvation Army. If we toss our T-shirts into the Salvation Army bin, the Salvation Army, of course, then needs to think, well, what are we going to do with these T-shirts? And, the bottom line, for better or for worse, is that the United States is simply too wealthy a country to have demand for all of these secondhand T-shirts. I don't want your old T-shirts and you don't want mine. So, what happens to these? There's not enough, even if we were to give them away in the United States, there just aren't enough people to wear all of the stuff that we throw away. So the Salvation Army will generally, keep some of this clothing and, use it in shelters, for example, or sell it in its thrift stores. But most of the clothing is actually sold by the pound to private companies. And the private companies then sort through the clothing, and they bale it up, and they ship it to where the customers are. For winter clothing, a lot of times the customers would be in Eastern Europe. For light clothing like T-shirts, the customers might be in Africa. Really, there's a whole industry that has sprung up where the expertise in this industry is sorting through the mountains of stuff that you and I throw away and finding buyers for it.
And this works better, you describe in the book, than donation. And why does it work better than donation of old clothes to wherever you think needs them?
Well, we are donating them when we toss them in the Salvation Army bin. And the Salvation Army is, of course, going to benefit because they're going to sell these clothes to the private company, and then they're going to take the money they've made and use it to support their charitable activities. So we really are donating it. The problem with directly donating clothing to a place that you think actually needs it is it very rarely helps. For example, in situations like Hurricane Katrina, a lot of well-intentioned people said, let's donate clothing. The problem is if you actually go, to the Red Cross website or something, it'll actually say there in big letters, please don't send us any clothing. We don't have a way to sort it, to distribute it, to get it to the people who could use it. If you look at kind of the logistics and distribution of what this takes, these are the kinds of things that businesses are good at. And unfortunately, when you start with, things like these clothing drives, the we're well intentioned, but tossing our clothing into some heap is unlikely to help the victims of of something like Hurricane Katrina.
And when these companies, when these large firms take the clothes that we do donate at the first stop in the supply chain there, you might call it, and they bring them over to, let's say, Africa, because it's what you talk about in the book, what does it do for entrepreneurship there in the countries that these T-shirts reach?
Well, this was, there's actually been quite a bit of some very interesting academic research on this, and I'm not going to claim to be one of the experts on this, but, when I was in Africa, one of the things that I thought was so interesting and so much fun to watch was the entrepreneurial activity associated with the clothing trade. In Tanzania, the word for this clothing is it's called mitumba in Swahili. The entrepreneurial spirit that I saw there, just in terms of the talent people had, and in sorting through these bales of clothing and deciding, which kind of shop would take which kind of shirt and how much to charge for it, and so forth and so on. I mean, it was really kind of like, you go to the mall here in the United States and you see dozens of different clothing stores trying to cater to hundreds of different customers. It was the same thing that I observed in Africa, but of course it's just so much more challenging in Africa because if you're a clothing store here in the mall, you order the clothing you think will sell. If you are an entrepreneur in Africa and you get a bale of used clothing from New York, you get what you get. And so the creativity that's required to make something out of, really what are cast-offs was just astonishing to me.
This is one of the perfect examples, I suppose, you could see first person of the power of markets to distribute resources to those who want them the most and those who will pay for them. It's just all right there happening in front of your eyes, right?
It is. It's a very alive thing to watch, these markets. One of the things that I thought was very interesting, for example, is just if you look at it's something like khaki pants. If you go into Sears or Walmart here, khaki pants of different, size, say 32, 34, 36, will of course all be the same price. In the African markets, the prices vary because of supply and demand. Because the entrepreneur who set up this used clothing stand wasn't able to order, lots and lots of pair of 34s. They get what they get. And so the pricing kind of has to adjust to what's in that bale.
And you describe in the book the customers there in Africa, when they're going shopping for this mitumba, they actually display a little more style discrimination than we do here in the U.S.
Well, again, you just have to be an awfully astute shopper, if you're shopping in these settings. And some of these markets, literally go on for a mile. So, you don't know. You have a pretty good idea here in the United States if you walk in to, say, Gap, what kind of things you're going to find. But you don't know in the African used clothing markets. There are just all these surprises. If you're a shopper, if you're somebody who likes like thrift shops here. You'd have a blast there.
Now, I want to take it back to the U.S. and ask the animus that has cropped up toward large firms, for example, Walmart being the poster firm of this phenomenon. How is that tied in with globalization? Is it one and the same where people have kind of an anger toward globalization and it becomes anger at large firms, or what is that?
No, I think it's related. I'm not sure if I'd dump it completely into the same category, but it is related. There's a lot of, I think, justifiable nervousness. There's also a lot of, kind of populist rhetoric that's traditional in the United States against anything that gets too big and powerful. So whether this was the monopolies of the early 1900s or whether it's Walmart today, but I think that there's something, and you heard it, I think, with some of the current presidential rhetoric, especially like Senator Edwards. I think that there is a basic populism here in the United States, and there is an essential mistrust, really, of big corporations at some level. Some of that has been earned, certainly, if you look at cases such as Enron. But I think there's also elements of it that are just that are cultural for us.
What can people or should people do, politically or otherwise, to help globalization, help them? Is there something people can do to improve the process of globalization, or is it something that's just going and we got to just sit back?
This is a very important question. We have to. It's not a biological process over which we have no control. Markets and globalization have to operate in the rules that we write. So in the United States, for example, you have a lot of conservatives who like the idea of a free market economy. But of course we don't have a free market economy, and very few people would actually want a free market economy where there weren't any rules at all. Every kind of market, every business has to operate in the context of the rules that are written by the society in which it operates. And so we do have to have rules. We have to have global rules, which is, ideally what the WTO would be in charge of. We have to have national rules, and we do have, power over what these rules are and who writes them and so forth and so on. So, as citizens, there's a lot we can do. And I think there's a lot that's actually, that has been done. In the latest round of, or the future rounds of trade agreements, for example, there are provisions in those trade agreements for addressing labor and environmental standards, for example. Now, the other thing that people, should be aware of is, that you need to think about every dollar you spend is really a vote. You're supporting something with that dollar. And I think consumers are becoming more aware of this idea. You certainly see it in food, where people like the idea of supporting, say, local farmers and so forth. But you're seeing it more and more with all kinds of goods. Consumers are interested in the environmental footprint of what they're buying. And so I think that, people are developing more of an instinct, really, to kind of think about, where things come from and what they are supporting when they spend a dollar. And I think that that's a positive development, too.
You would advocate a more conscious consumerism, in other words.
I would. I think that there's certainly nothing to be lost, right, in understanding a little bit more about where things come from. And I think there's a lot to be gained.
Now, globalization and the environment, you did mention environmental effects, and some people will say that this is a huge threat, globalization itself is, to the environment, and if something isn't done, it's going to be the end times or whatever. And I'm guessing you would call that a little overstatement of the threat, but what do you think about the effects of globalization on the environment?
It's such an interesting question. It's actually something that I really didn't address in my book, but during the past year or so, as I've traveled around speaking about the book, more and more it's what audiences want to hear about. And so I'm actually writing the book, a second edition of this book, precisely to incorporate some of these environmental issues, because they've really just kind of burst onto the stage in the way that sweatshop concerns kind of burst onto the stage 8 or 9 years ago. So, there's a tremendous amount of interest, and it's also, of course, a tremendously important question. I can't say that I'd want to, draw a causal line. Is globalization the cause of environmental degradation? You can certainly create logic that leads you to that conclusion, but there's a lot of logic running in the reverse direction as well. So, for example, one of the technologies that the United States and Japan and also Western Europe are starting to excel at is all kinds of environmental protection technology. And globalization, of course, allows that technology to be exported to other countries. So I think that, positive and negative environmental effects can relate from globalization. The environmental movement is itself the result of globalization. In other words, this is a global movement, and it is the flow of ideas, the flow of activism, and so forth across borders on this issue that makes the movement so powerful.
Do you think that environmental problems are better addressed technologically than politically?
Well, I don't think you can really separate those things. So if you listen to Senator Clinton or Senator Obama right now in some of the debates, it's interesting. They're both advocating for investment, government-led investment in clean technologies. And so I do think that there's an important role for public policy in directing that kind of investment. But politics isn't separate from the investment.
You've mentioned that the world has changed since you've put out the first edition of this book and are now working on the second. What else in those few years have you thought that you've had to address in the second edition? What is different now than when the first edition, not too long ago, of Travels of a T-Shirt was released?
I'm a college professor, and I've spent my life, my career mostly at this one university. And I guess what I realize is that, out there in what people like to call the real world, everything changes a lot faster than it does in a university.
That's what I've heard.
So, I'm not sure, for example, about your business, Colin, journalism. I'm not sure the extent to which you see changes, from year to year. In universities, I think changes tend to be sort of marginal, sort of slow, sort of incremental. And so if you dropped in at Georgetown University in 2005, I'm not sure you'd find a lot different if you came back in 2008. But my experience in kind of going back to a lot of the places that I've been when I wrote the first edition of this book is out there in the world, everything changes so much more rapidly. So, the whole technology, for example, of stripping cotton has changed in just a few short years. They have new technology now that, it's just another whole leap forward, for example. The whole way in which companies manage their supply chains has changed dramatically as well. So, for example, the various ways that companies like Walmart or Gap or so forth, try to maintain the integrity of their supply chain, the sophistication of their methods for monitoring, all that has changed dramatically. The pace of the growth in trade has changed dramatically. So, the pace at which industries move from place to place, has changed a lot. So I think that the main thing that I learned is really if you're looking out there at the world of business, whether you're talking to a cotton grower or a textile worker or a trade negotiator, things move so much more quickly than at least I was used to growing up in an academic setting.
And as I understand it, this sort of thing is not in any way slowing down. So at this rate, you're going to have to bring out a third edition in 2009.
Well, I don't want to quite think that far ahead.
That's understandable. Now, at the beginning and the end of the book, you mention these protesters, these anti-globalization, anti-WTO protesters, and looking back on what you learned in these set of journeys, and what, of course, you've learned since the publication of the book, what would you tell protesters? What is the most important thing for people to know about globalization?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is, a version of the Hippocratic Oath is try to do no harm. I think that, sometimes it's easy to be well-intentioned but end up with your actions having harmful effects. So, for example, there's a lot of tricky issues in which, this kind of activism can end up backfiring. A typical one is child labor. Earlier this year, it was, we found that there were children working in a subcontractor's factory making apparel for the Gap. Of course, no one is in favor of that, and everyone believes that children belong in school, and having kids working in these factories is absolutely abhorrent. The question is, what's the right response? Is it the right thing to do to just fire them all right now? Well, we've solved the child labor problem, but are the children better off?
That sends them back to the farm, essentially.
Well, who knows where it sends them?
Oh.
Maybe it sends them into prostitution. Maybe it sends them out into the street. Maybe, we don't know. The point is that, if we don't think about the consequences of our activism, it's possible that we can do harm. And you have to be very sophisticated, very careful in kind of targeting your activism so that you actually are helping the people you're trying to help. So that's one thing I would say. And there have been some very creative programs, I think, when activists do think about the consequences. So, for example, we have some incredibly good companies in the United States. Levi Strauss was a great example where, when they discovered children working in their supply chain, they actually arranged to keep paying the children if the children would instead attend school. Now, there's an example, of kind of enlightened activism that will leave the kids better off. But just saying, get rid of those child workers is not likely to leave them better off. So my first point, again, is just to think through carefully the effects of what you're asking for. And be careful what you ask for because, you might get it. The second thing I'd say is that, I've developed a tremendous amount of respect for a lot of the activists I met. And one of the remarkable things to me, now that I have a little bit of time perspective, is, how quickly crazy ideas become mainstream ideas. This is something that, I've observed just in the past 5 or 6 or 7 years. A lot of the things that the people on the so-called fringe, were asking for and demanding 5 or 6 or 7 years ago are now just thought to be, kind of mainstream, easy to support ideas. So, and this is true, I think, throughout, industrial history. The first person to call for a minimum wage, sounded pretty loony. But now, of course, we kind of look at that as a normal part of the world, a normal part of the business environment. The first people to call for factory disclosure, in other words, making companies, tell you where the factories were that produced their clothing. That was initially thought to be an outrageous demand, but now pretty much all the companies are doing it. So, the other thing, is I've developed a lot of respect, really, for kind of what I call kind of the leading-edge thinkers. Not that I always agree with them, not that I always would like to see things necessarily go their way, but, certainly they're the leading edge in many cases of public opinion.
The book, once again, is The Travels of a T-Shirt in the Global Economy. Pietra Rivoli, thank you so much for coming on the Marketplace of Ideas.
Thank you, Colin. It's a pleasure.
Our music is composed by Ben Althaus. Check out his website, benalthouse, that's BenAlthouse.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com.